We now return to Illinois Rising, presented by the Illinois Policy Institute, the radio show discussing the honest truth about Illinois policy and politics. Here's AM 560's Dan Proft.
Welcome back to Illinois Rising. I'm Pat Hughes of the Illinois Opportunity Project. Dan Proft is taking this Sunday off. Joining me in his place is a dear friend of ours and a friend of the program, Brian Timpone, who is the founder of Local Labs and a media entrepreneur who does tremendous work in our great state and elsewhere. Brian, speaking of our great state and elsewhere, Amazon has a choice. They have a choice to come here potentially, or they have a choice to go pretty much anywhere else they'd like. Before we bring on our guest, what is your thought about their chances of coming to the great state of Illinois?
I don't think the chances are very good. Our tax burden is suffocating, and the future doesn't look very bright because of our pension debt. So if Jeff Bezos wants to come to Chicago, it's kind of like putting himself in a trap within the reach of the tentacles of the Chicago machine. That would be pretty scary for anybody.
Well, let's see if our next guest agrees with you. I have a suspicion that he does. I certainly think that I do, but I'd like to hear more from Steve Malanga. He's the senior editor at City Journal, which is a publication of the Great Manhattan Institute. Steve, thank you so much for joining us on Illinois Rising.
Oh, my pleasure.
So you've done a piece on Amazon and done some analysis on this. Obviously, they're a major name, perhaps the major name in terms of a corporate entity that would come to the state of Illinois. Obviously, we have massive structural problems here, but we have a governor of Illinois, and Bruce Rauner, and a mayor, Rahm Emanuel, who are pitching Bezos and his team on bringing Amazon here. What are your thoughts?
Well, first of all, join the club. There were 238 metropolitan areas that submitted bids. I think that officially the U.S. government recognizes 373 or 72 metro areas in the United States. So that's pretty much.
So we got two-thirds of them. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So everyone jumped in, forcing in some states governors to make choices. Because some metropolitan areas just went ahead and made their own bids, even though the state was backing another area's bid. Here's the thing. One of the things I wrote about is that this list that Amazon put out of the criteria is so expansive. They're looking for everything. They're basically looking for utopia. And it's not only expansive, but it's in some ways contradictory. As someone said, that some of their things that they want are inversely correlated, which basically means they want a growing business environment, but they also want a low cost of living. Now, typically, places that are growing very rapidly, are attractive, and you get higher rents. I mean, you higher housing prices. That's what happens. So I don't know whether, the real issue is what their priorities are. Some people, I've looked at a whole bunch of lists that so-called experts have made, and the funny thing about the lists is that they're dramatically different, and I think that really goes to what Amazon really wants. Chicago is actually on some of the lists. They're not ranked very high, but they actually make some of the lists. There was one recently by a New York firm, and Chicago was ranked, 10th. But that's a list that's very heavy with traditional expensive big cities like New York and San Francisco and Boston. Chicago, ranks low in that group, but it's at least on the list. Now, there are other, rankings that really focus instead on cities like Seattle, which is where Amazon is headquartered now. And on those lists, the winners tend to be places like Denver and Atlanta, Toronto, because Amazon did say North America, not just the United States. So I think it's a reflection of how confused people are. But I do think on any of the lists, Chicago is a kind of an outsider, if you will, because of the state's structural problems, long-term structural problems.
Do you think that Jeff Bezos is looking at this as a situation where he thinks he can lock in his risk and tell Rahm Emanuel and the state, hey, I'll come if you try to prevent some of the downside tax risk? Do you think that's even plausible?
Well, first of all, I think that's going to be highly likely. That's the message. Since you have 238 places, competing, and they're all competing with tax incentives, and Amazon has said we intend to look at the incentives. Essentially, the issue is that they think probably that they can offset the tax burden of places, because some places are willing to give them. I mean, the numbers that have been thrown around are billions of dollars. Some places have some of the places that have bid haven't even admitted to how much they're offering in tax incentives, because this is a very controversial issue around the country. But the places that have come forward, the numbers are quite big. And one of the things I said is that if you look at a place like, very progressively run cities like San Francisco and New York, you wonder how much they can give away to someone like Amazon. In Chicago, I think the issue is you see Chicago homeowners getting hit with one property tax increase after another to pay for the pension bill. Can they really turn around, the city and the state, and give billions of dollars to a company run by the richest man, one of the richest men, in America, while everybody else is paying these big property tax increases?
So Steve,
all part of the.
Yeah, so Steve, the answer to that question is yes, they can, and they want to, and they would. And the reason is because everything you just said obviously is correct. I don't see the ultimate economic payoff of having Amazon here if you're going to give them edge tax credits, which is how we do it here in Illinois. If you're going to give them all sorts of incentives, and you're going to just place the cost of those incentives on the backs of taxpayers who have already been taxed enough. But it does do one thing specifically. It allows Bruce Rauner and or Rahm Emanuel, who are both up for re-election, Rauner in 18, Emanuel in 19, right, to say, I brought the big, giant Amazon to Illinois and run it in TV commercials over and over again. And that's the reason why they want to bring it here, in my opinion. Not because it's going to make a giant economic impact. It may even be an economic detriment long term. It's hard to tell. We don't know. But they certainly want to have that on their mantle when campaign season comes around.
Well, I agree with you, and but by the way, that's not just something that Rauner and Emanuel do. That's the reason tax incentives exist, because if you look over and over and over again, tax incentives rarely pay back the investment that they constitute. They rarely, when we go back in retrospect and look at how many jobs, companies create who get big tax incentives, usually the cost of each job is fantastic, hundreds of thousands of dollars. That's basically what they're getting, what the state and the city is paying. So they rarely pencil out, but it's a big victory. And Chris Christie touted Amazon opening up a huge warehouse, hiring 3,000 people in New Jersey. It was a big victory. They gave them, the state of New Jersey gave significant tax credits for that. So that's pretty common. The larger issue, I think, with a place like Chicago is whether the other things facing Chicago long term, including not just the pension debt, but Chicago does have a somewhat well-advertised crime problem, for instance. I don't know how significant that will be in Amazon's estimation of all of this, and because they do speak very specifically about quality of life also, and they are asking for things like crime rates in their analyses.
He's Steve Malanga. He's with City Journal. Steve, thank you so much for joining us in Illinois Rising. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.
So, Brian, big crime states, bad, in terms of the city of Chicago, bad tax circumstances, huge pension problems. We got about 90 seconds left. Does Bezos come here? Can he be incentivized to come here? Does anybody other than Emanuel and Rauner and the politicians want him to come here?
Well, Chicago is in one unique spot. It's one of the only cities that has enough people to staff the type of talent that Amazon claims it wants. So in one regard, it is on a short list just because of its size. But there is a great irony to Amazon trying to come here and get tax breaks, because Amazon's success in delivering groceries and taking the Targets and Costco's, competing away those businesses, will eventually put more pressure on local governments by taking away their local commercial and industrial tax revenue and force bankruptcy faster than it would have happen otherwise. So Amazon might be another domino or the push on the domino to drive us to our inevitable bankruptcy, which is coming. It's just a matter of when.
God, wouldn't that be ironic, right? These major politicians, from Mike Madigan to Rahm Emanuel, and then to a certain extent over the last 3 years, unfortunately, Bruce Rauner, because he couldn't prevent anything from happening, have taxed and spent everybody in this state to death. And their solution is to bring in this giant, this corporate behemoth to solve the problem. But in the end, it might be that giant corporate behemoth that kills us and makes us dead finally.
The free market is powerful.